out of town. So as we start this morning, I want to think about when I'm sick or injured, babies, when I'm sick or injured, it often helps to be able to identify the cause of my symptoms. So is my leg broken? Do I have the flu and I need medicine? And the same thing with emotional pain. Why do I feel this way? What caused this? Is my reaction make sense? And our hurts and our experiences that are negative, they can be because of a particular reason, or there might be a combination of reasons. One thing that I want us to remember as we're going to talk today is that there is often more going on than we can see or recognize with our senses. There are often other things happening that cause the negative things that we experience that we might not always attribute to them. So we've spent the last several Sundays this year, beginning at the beginning of the year, looking at the concept of what's called church hurts, or negative things that we might experience in a collection of God's people. And we've spent some time looking at specific things. If I feel like I'm neglected or alone, or somebody has sinned against me, or I'm under bad leaders, and all kinds of things that can happen. But today I want to move on after looking at those specific hurts and ask the question, why do these kinds of things happen in the first place? So really those events that we experience, or the negative things that hurt us, are really symptoms of other problems. And so what do those symptoms point to? Why do these things happen? And that's going to be what we answer today. Why do church hurts happen in the first place? So as I'm growing in spiritual maturity, I am constantly recognizing the importance of accepting reality, or living life on life's terms. Because when I decide that I want to escape reality because I don't like what's going on, or I can't deal with what's happening to me, I cause myself a lot of problems. When we can't accept reality, in this case, what we're talking about, that bad things happen to us, it can wreak all kinds of havoc. Emotionally, spiritually. And here's a cornerstone of reality that we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about. The world is fallen. It's broken. It wasn't intended to be, but it's broken now. And so there are aspects of struggle and decay and pain that are now natural parts of experience in this world. And so one of the things I want to point us to is in Genesis chapter 3, and this is one of the first 3 chapters of the entire Bible. This is after the 2 first human beings have decided to rebel against God. They decided we're going to do what we want instead of what He said to us. And this is God essentially saying, these are the consequences of what you've decided to do. And it says, to the woman He said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. And your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And to Adam He said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. And in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. And by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so God gives all of these specific consequences to them of what's going to happen. Pain in childbearing, that Adam is going to have to toil in the soil. And the world did not start this way. We weren't supposed to die. We were supposed to be with God forever. The things that God's given us weren't supposed to be so laborious and so painful for us, but they are. And we see that there is, throughout this paragraph that we've just read, pain, desire, curse, difficulty, and ultimately death. And these are all results and things that continue in a broken world. These are the results of what happened when human beings first rebelled against God and damaged their relationship with Him. That's really the cause. That the relationship between human beings and God was damaged, and so because of that damage and that distancing, all kinds of fallout happen. And part of that is what happens in the world. But as children of God, we understand that Jesus' work, at least in part, was to undo the effects of the fall, the things that we've just read. And that this is part of our redemption and our reconciliation, of which God takes us out of the brokenness. He reconciles us, like we just talked about a few moments ago. And that is in the hope that one day we will be with Him perfectly united, the way that we were supposed to be at the beginning. And I think of 1 Corinthians 15:22, where Paul says, "For as in Adam all die," the first human, we all as humans all die because of that, "so also in Christ shall all be made alive." So all of us as human beings experience that death, but in Christ we can have life. And so understanding this reality, that there is a broken, fallen world, and we accept that and we realize that that is what is happening, what would you expect to observe in human relationships and in the different things that we try to accomplish in this life? If this is the reality of what the world is now, what would we expect to happen? Why do hurts happen in the church? They're symptoms of these problems that we're talking about. And so one of the first things, we're going to point out 3 points today as to dealing with this idea of why do these hurts happen. And the first one of why hurts happen is that people are weak and people sin. And that's reality. And we also need to say, me too. It's not just you, it's me. The reality of the world is that it is broken along with the people and the things in it. And again, that's not the way that it began, and that's not the way that God wanted it to be, but through the exercise of our own free will and our deciding to go a different way, this is the consequences. But through God's work, it is waiting to be released and to be renewed. The church is a manifestation of this work. We're being renewed by God's power. And so we're all born into this world, and we all have brokenness and different things that we carry along with us. But as a child of God in Jesus, hopefully you are experiencing some of the reversing of those effects as you see the progress of the Spirit in you and the fact that we have a way to deal with this brokenness through Jesus. And so we would hopefully expect less of the brokenness within the church that we might experience throughout the rest of the world, but sadly that's not always been the case. Sometimes people experience just as much, if not more, hurt in church than they do in the rest of the world. And it is not supposed to be that way. But because our future hope is not fully realized, and we realize that we are not totally perfected, but that God is working inside of us, we should expect some measure of imperfection. It should not surprise us when people are weak, when people sin, because I experience that every single day inside myself. And so we have to be careful about pointing fingers, but how should we handle those who are genuinely struggling with weakness and with sin? We've talked about some examples of what that looks like in our lives. I just want to look at a couple passages that deal with this idea. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5, "And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." So when we recognize that there is brokenness and hurt and sin and weakness in this world and in human beings, one of the things that Paul says here in a specific situation is help them. Admonish them or encourage them, help them, be patient with them all. And he writes in another passage in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, and this is more so about someone who is caught up in sin. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. And keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so when someone is caught up in sin, how do we respond? The way that we're supposed to respond, according to the apostle here, is to restore them in the spirit of gentleness. And someone who is honestly trying to do better, this is the attitude to have. And he points to the fact, watch yourself too, because you might be caught up in this. And we see that these are the examples and the encouragements or the instructions of how we're supposed to deal with certain things. But if you take a step back and think about it, why should this be how we act? When someone sins against me, when because of someone's weakness I'm hurt, why should I do this at all? So we think about that for a couple minutes. And sort of taking this next one out of context, you could say, because we all stumble in many ways, as James said. And he says if anyone does not stumble, for instance, in that context, and what he says, then he's perfect. But we all stumble, and we all make mistakes, and we all have differences in brokenness. And this reminded me of Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and sort of those kind of philosophical musings there. The writer remarks, surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good all the time, is what he's talking about, and never sins. There's not a single one of us who always does the right thing. And if there is, you can stand up and I will sit down. And we could add to this Paul's discussion in Romans 3 and all kinds of things. But we should remark that we are in the process of being renovated into the image of Christ. It is a process. And so we still have weaknesses and things that need to be repaired and reformed and forgiven. And I want to give you an example. This is from my own life, and this is quite embarrassing. So a few weeks ago, Chip and I, and Chip's not here today, but Chip and I had said, okay, we're going to go to the library. We're going to try to pass out Bibles and talk to people. And we had gone through and tried to make this date a couple times. But Chip and I had made those plans. And at that point, someone was home sick. I feel like our family has been sick for months. And so I was tired from staying up late all night taking care of things like that. And so I decided I'm going to take a nap before I go and meet with Chip. And guess what happened? I overslept and I was late. And by the time I got there, Chip was already gone. And I felt awful. This wasn't because I was intentionally sinning against Chip. And thankfully, he forgave me and we met up later and we did what we were intending to do. But that was a situation of my weakness. Whether you want to say it's fatigue or not communicating, or maybe it's I was thinking about my own needs before maybe what Chip was expecting and looking forward to. It was an episode of my own weakness and frailty. And that's just one, maybe that's trivial to you, I don't know. It really bothered me. But you can think of other situations when someone's let you down or if they sinned against you. In some of the ways that we've talked about in previous weeks, we have all been there. We've all been the one who has been hurt, and we've all been the one who has done the hurting. There is a conflict within each one of us. And I toyed with the idea of going and doing sort of a deep dive into part of Romans chapter 7, where Paul discusses this conflict between the flesh or the human part of us and the spirit or the spiritual part. And that was within him, and that's within us all. Well, I decided that was maybe a little bit too much for today, so I'll spare you of that. But I want to share with you a quote that I think really encapsulates the idea that we're talking about here. When we experience sin in the church, we should be grieved, but we shouldn't be surprised. Often we come with this idea that everything's going to be perfect and everyone's going to be perfect. And those are the expectations that we hold for other people. But that's not the reality. And so when bad things happen, we should be grieved. Because for one, it points to the brokenness and fallenness of the world. Also, it is not fun, but we should not be surprised. Because that is the reality of our world. And that people are broken, and that we are trying to be renovated or renewed and changed into who Jesus is. But we often fall short of that. And when I understand that I am not perfect, I should remember that neither is anyone else. And so their weaknesses should not be a surprise to me, because I see mine every single day. When I see that God has forgiven me, even though He knows who I am and what I have done and what I continue to do, I should find motivation to forgive others of their weaknesses and their sin as God has forgiven mine. And that is one of the big reasons of why we should behave in the way that we read moments ago. And when we decide not to, and we hold on to the resentments or we nurture bad feelings, we refuse to see ourselves and others clearly and to accept reality as it is and to work toward the reconciliation that God started. It's my way over God's way when we hold on to these things and refuse to work through them. As our theme verse for 2025, as we're talking about being bonded by love this whole year, our theme verse, which I think fits well here, is put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. Why? Why are we supposed to forgive each other? As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. When I see the world the way that it is in reality, and I understand who I am, and I understand correctly who other people are, and I see that God has forgiven me in spite of who I am, I need to forgive others as well. In trying to be like God, that's what God does. In extending grace to others, that's what God does. And so that's what we are supposed to do. But other people are not the only cause of the hurts that we experience in the church and in the world in general. Did you know that? There are other causes besides people. We have an enemy. There are people who are trying to hurt us. And so another reason that hurts happen is because Satan hates the church. How often do you think about that? If we look, for instance, at 1 Peter 5, the Apostle Peter tells us, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world." That name that we say Satan, that actually means the adversary. That's what Satan means. And it was a title really more so than a name. But Peter tells us that he is walking around trying to harm us. And that our brothers and sisters throughout the whole world are experiencing the same thing. We have an enemy who is trying to harm us, and that is Satan. And so another thing that the apostles tell us, for instance, if you think about this idea of the armor of God that many are familiar with, and don't ask me to repeat them all. I don't know if I have them memorized. That's embarrassing. But it says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. The devil is scheming, and he's prowling, and he's looking for an opportunity to cause hurts and divisions and conflict, and to make you sin against someone else, and to make you take what they have done personally. Satan works against the church, and he wishes to see it destroyed. So controversies and sins sometimes have a cause in the spiritual realities around us that we do not see with our eyes. And Jesus alludes to this spiritual warfare in the Gospels multiple times. Jesus talks about this. Just a couple that I'll reference in John 12:31. Jesus says, now is the judgment of this world, and now will the ruler of this world be cast out. In John 14:30, he says, I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming, and he has no claim on me. So before Jesus goes and experiences the things that he does in his suffering and his death, he says there's a fight that's coming. The ruler of this world, Satan, is appearing. And he says he's going to be beaten. But there is a fight. This onslaught from Satan and his henchmen, and these are just other beings, spiritual beings who were created and by their own choice have decided to go against God as we did. They are attacking God's people. And this sounds a little strange to our modern sensibilities, that these kind of things are real. But in some ways, they're more real than we are. This is spiritual reality. And this kind of fight is vividly talked about in the book of Revelation, and we're just going to read some things and take an observation. And if you've never heard this before and it's strange to you, this is a visionary experience that one of the apostles of Jesus was having. And this was essentially pictures and symbols that God was showing him to teach him what was going on. And so part of this vision that he saw, it says, now war arose in heaven, and Michael and his angels fighting back against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they love not their lives even unto death. And therefore rejoice, O heaven, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And we'll continue on. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. There's a lot going on there, and we're not going to talk about all those details, obviously. But to sum this up, we see that after Christ's victory in the cross, it talks about the blood of the Lamb throwing down the great dragon Satan out of heaven, his defeat. We see that after Christ's victory, Satan pursues the church in revenge and desperation. And that's what I want us to take away from that. Satan knows that he's beaten. And he's vengeful. And he hates us. And so he tries to harm God's people as much as he possibly can. And that is a reality. That is something that happens even when we don't think about it. But Christ has been victorious. And so a while ago we mentioned Romans chapter 7 and Paul's discussion of this conflict inside of people between the human earthly part of me and the spiritual part that God has put in. And he remarks at one point, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Or we could rephrase it, who can save us from this situation and defeat our enemy? And so our last point this morning, whether we look at the fallenness of the world or we look at the fact that people are weak sometimes and they sin, or we look at the fact that Satan hates us and tries to harm us, we need to remember that Jesus has overcome all of it. He has been victorious over everything. And so after asking that question, Paul says, "Thanks be to God through Jesus our Lord." He is the one who can save me from this. He is the one who can defeat my enemy. And this is where we took our reading from this morning, where Josh read for us. And this is remarking on mostly part of what is going on in the world around us. When we see the futility and the brokenness of what happens around us, the apostle says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, what we experience, are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? The creation was subjected to futility, and it groans in weakness. And we talked about the fact that things are broken. And they're not the way that they were supposed to be, but they're the way that they are. And so the apostle says that there is an end in sight to that, when all of it is going to be restored and renewed and freed from its bondage, when we will become who we are supposed to be in the presence of God. And we also talked about, or I should say I alluded to, the discussion that Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, "For as in Adam all die," so all people who partake of human nature die. "So also in Christ shall all be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, the first one to come. Then at his coming, those who belong to Christ. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, after destroying every rule and every authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death." So this is a lot to take in, obviously. The apostles are writing about things that are beyond our comprehension and beyond things that we can detect with our senses. But the point is that the world is broken and that God is going to fix that, and that this happened through what Jesus did, and that Jesus has been victorious through his suffering and his death, and God's raising him from the dead to show that he was victorious, and that he has beaten every rule and every authority and every power. And that may be dictators in this world, that might be spiritual beings such as Satan who are trying to harm us, that might be our own sins. But no matter what it is, Jesus has won. And one day we'll see that as it is. That is what the apostle is telling us. In Christ, we can trust in his victory and experience it here as we await to experience it fully. And so in the church, we are afforded a taste of what we will see in the future. Being renewed in the image of God, and things being made right and reconciled and returned to the way that they were supposed to be. And so Paul says in Romans 8, as we talked about, that through our hope in these things we are saved. So we surrender ourselves to God in trusting that God says that he has fixed it all. Okay, I am going to give myself to you and wait for that and trust that what you say is true. And we're looking for something better, right? If this is all there is, I don't want any part of it. There is something better. And we'll see that when our redemption becomes fully realized. And so we kind of look over what we've talked about. First thing that we said is the world is broken. And you can see that all over the place. Things do not work the way that they were supposed to. This is not the way that God intended things to be, but it is the way that things are because of the realities that exist around us. And we see that one of the reasons that hurt happens is because people are weak and people sin. And I need to include myself in that. That's not just all of you. That's not just your family members, but it's us too. We also see that Satan hates the church. And he's trying to do whatever he can out of his last desperate attempt to cause harm and to wreak havoc. But we need to understand that underneath all of that is this bedrock fact that Jesus is victorious over everything. That no matter what is out there, he has beat it. And so while we are still here, we should recognize and expect some difficulty and pain. And shouldn't be surprised when those things happen, but see Christ's victory through it all. Whatever the negative, Jesus has overcome it. And that's what I want you to take away today. We experience a lot of things in life. We experience them in the church. And that is part of existence now. That's something that we have to come to terms with. But remember the fact that Jesus wins. And that is the supreme reality over this entire universe. That Jesus wins. So if you're thinking today about yourself, and you realize that you have this same kind of brokenness and pain, and maybe it's guilt and shame about things that you've done, maybe it's just not knowing what you're supposed to do, maybe fill in the blank of whatever it is, and you're looking for something more, I want you to see what we've talked about today, that there are all kinds of things happening around you that you can't even possibly understand. But God has done something about it. He has brought forth a solution to the problem, and his name is Jesus. And Jesus beat everything. He won it all. And if you're looking for victory over the things in your life, if you're looking for something more, if you're looking for something to hope in, then Jesus can provide that for you. And we want to help you in whatever way we can. So if you want to talk to someone after the service, If you want to come forward in a minute when Greg is going to lead us in a song, you can sit on one of the front pews and we can talk. Whatever you need, just let us know. Greg will lead us in this song.
Sir.